So in the early 2010s, when a lot of this modern day programmatic advertising was coming online, I remember having coffee with someone, a friend who worked at one of these ad buying agencies. And she was like making this argument that you heard a lot at the time that media companies can now have the same level of ad targeting scale as like the big tech platforms like Google. And this will level the playing field, and that the CPMs for premium publishers are only going to keep on going back up. And we're going to be able to like put all this toothpaste back in the tube, and we're no longer trading digital pennies for print dollars type of thing. There was like all this optimism. Flash forward 12 years later, the tech platforms are still getting more and more marketing share every year, and that's all coming from the publisher side. Now Amazon's taking that marketing share. It seems like programmatic is no longer living up to that promise, or never did. Now that theoretically programmatic allows publishers to have the same level of scale of inventory collectively to the tech platforms, why are the tech platforms still outperforming the media companies and stealing more and more share?
What is the old Peter Thielism, winner take most, which is one of those Silicon Valley euphemisms for monopoly. Setting that aside, that's one reason. But performance-wise, they work better because the data is better.
Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and this is The Business of Content, the show about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. Digital advertising has long been shaped by a David-versus-Goliath dynamic, with publishers struggling to compete against tech platforms that control better data, more powerful ad tools, and vastly larger pools of advertiser demand. That raises a few big questions. Why have publishers struggled to close that gap despite the promise of programmatic advertising? What advantages do platforms like Google and Meta have that the open web still lacks? And as AI takes on a larger role in ad buying, could it help level the playing field or further entrench the dominance of the larger platforms? Rick Erwin, CEO of Adstra and a longtime ad tech executive, has spent decades working at the center of these shifts. In a recent interview, he explained why tech platforms have built such a durable advantage over publishers, how advertisers decide who sees their ads, and why he believes AI could fundamentally change how ad campaigns are planned and executed. If you want to listen to an audio version of this show, subscribe to The Business of Content wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, let's jump into the interview. Hey, Rick, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Simon. I'm glad to be here.
The reason I had you on is because, I've been running this podcast since like 2018, 2019, and most of the guests that have been on the show have been kind of like on the publisher and media side, and kind of like a weakness in my coverage, a gap in my coverage has been more on kind of like the tech and services side, specifically, not just the publishing tech, but also the ad tech side. So that's why I reached out to you. You run a company called Adstra, and you also before we talk about what you're doing with Adstra. I'm pronouncing that correctly, right?
You are Adstra. Yes.
Before we talk about that, you actually have an even deeper background in marketing tech, advertising tech, and I think you were also on the board of directors for the IAB. So you helped set the standards for online advertisement and measurements and stuff like that. So I'd love, before we talk about how you became the CEO of Adstra, so can you give us a brief background what you were doing before then?
My potted bio. I got out of graduate business school in 1992, and at that time I went to Northwestern, and at that time almost everyone went into either consumer packaged goods marketing, investment banking, or management consulting. And so I was all ready to take my graduate marketing degree and go work in consumer packaged goods. And I had offers from a bunch of great companies, and through a serendipitous thing that isn't worth going into the detail on, a friend of mine asked me to interview with a company that he was being courted by, but he didn't want to join. And it was this company called R.R. Donnelley, the biggest printing company in the world. And I thought, okay, I'll do him a favor. And I went and had this interview where I realized here's a company that really needs management talent and doesn't have it. And it was a 150-year-old company or something at the time. And so I chucked everything and went to work there. And in that business, they had bought a data company that they thought would be a way for them to diversify away from print. They later sold that company, and that company was bought by Experian and became Experian Marketing Services. And I went to work, just totally serendipitously, went to work there, having left R.R. Donnelley. And that was the beginning of my career in data. But the arc since then, that was the early 2000s, has been just a blast, because back then, the only customers that used data were direct marketers, database marketers. So think credit card offers that you would get in the mail, or the nonprofit solicitations that you'll receive, and catalogs back in the day, if we can even remember when there were plentiful things like catalogs. And in that time, since I joined Experian, data is now ubiquitous in every form of advertising. And the way that that happened is that medium by medium became addressable at the individual level, which of course in the old days of linear television, that just wasn't possible. But once a medium becomes addressable at the individual consumer level, it confers a mandate on all the participants in that form of media to be able to identify individuals by the medium type, or by the device type, or by whichever identifier is applicable to that medium. And so I've watched and participated and helped drive the adoption of this data that used to be only for direct mail and database marketing to now be truly ubiquitous in almost every single form of advertising. So I was at Experian for about 10 years, and then I moved to traded up to the much larger version of that business at a company called Axiom. And ultimately we sold Axiom to Interpublic Group, which has now, as you know, been sold to Omnicom. And when that happened, my team and I, you have that high five dinner where you're celebrating, and then you kind of get around to, well, which of us wants to go and work inside of a big ad agency holding company? And there were crickets, and we realized that what we really wanted to do is go build the data and identity company that we always knew our clients wanted, but working in those bigger public companies, it was really hard to turn the ship in that direction. And that's how we created the idea of Adstra, and we can talk more about what that all entails, but we recruited private equity sponsorship and bought a company that I had known in the industry for a long time that was sort of tangentially involved in that stuff. And since then, we've really transformed Adstra into a major identity company in the data-driven marketing and advertising space.
Someone who was like there at the beginning of the 2000s in terms of like the rise of display advertising and then what became programmatic advertising, what capabilities did you see evolve over that 25 years time span, specifically like from early 2000s to like 2000, let's say 15 era? Like we all know the anecdotes of like you visit a shopping page, it attaches a cookie that then follows you around and then targets you at that level. So everybody's kind of understanding of that. But like obviously like things have gotten more sophisticated than like what did you see? What were some of like the biggest advances that you saw as someone who was like basically working behind the scenes on all this kind of tech?
It's an excellent question, because in some ways, certain things that I'll talk about changed radically, and in other ways, they more or less just remained the same with a little bit of evolution. And I'll explain what I mean by that second comment in a minute. But one of the most seminal things that needed to occur was for consumers and brands and partners that serve brands like ad agencies to become comfortable with the notion of online data mingling with quote unquote offline data. That is one of the most significant things, because you might remember back in the early 2000s there was an attempted acquisition that would have explicitly merged online and offline data, and it was disrupted by all kinds of lobbying groups, and I think there was even a regulatory action taken on it. At that time, people were not comfortable with it. The internet was pretty new, as you remember. People were just not comfortable with this new thing ever associating a real person with some form of persistent identity. And so that kept, as long as that attitude prevailed, that kept data-driven marketing and advertising from truly flourishing. And there's a company that most of your listeners will have probably heard of, called LiveRamp, which was when I met the Orrin Hoffman, the founder of LiveRamp. His company was teeny tiny. It was maybe 2008 or 2009. It wasn't even called LiveRamp at the time. It was called something else. And they had this really bold vision for helping people take their offline data and translate it into and make it activatable in the real world or in the online world. And
So when you're talking about
if you
offline
know,
data, are you talking about like I bought something at CVS or I recently took out a mortgage or something like that?
yes, or
Okay.
even just the simple thing of Rick Erwin at my home address, just even that. How do you turn that into a cookie accurately? I mean, you can put an inaccurate cookie against that and say that you've translated it, but how do you do it accurately? And that's what LiveRamp really stepped out and did. And once they did that, that business really took off. Later, the company I mentioned that I worked for, Axiom, acquired LiveRamp, and when we sold Axiom to IPG, LiveRamp remained as a standalone company as it still does today. But that's one of those things that I would point to as a very, very important juncture, because it all of a sudden got the world comfortable with the notion that, oh, this is all just information about consumers, and we're all trying to make better impressions upon consumers and hopefully persuade consumers to buy our products. This is a major threshold step to make that possible. But an example of the other kind, which was very just evolutionary, have you ever heard of people talk about this type of software called customer data platforms, CDPs? CDPs they're a natural evolution of the same sorts of technology software packages that marketers have been trying to use ever since I've been in the business. But back when I was starting in the early 2000s, that was campaign management software, and it was really only used by the kind of marketers, the direct marketers that I was referring to before. Well, that has just very slowly evolved. We had we had just various versions of campaign management software. Now, if you look at any one of the major CDPs offering, it looks virtually exactly the same as campaign management software. It does a lot more now because it's dealing with all sorts of different types of identifiers and many different points of activation that characterize the entire ad tech, martech world. But it's just the same thing. And that's an example of where sometimes a whole industry can change and quadruple in size, and some things really aren't that different. And the reason I bring up that type of technology is I've watched the arc of CRM, campaign management software, and now leading ultimately 25 years later to CDPs. It always changes and evolves into something else that is remarkably similar in intent, but just has a couple of extra layers of functionality. And that will happen, CDPs will evolve yet again into something else. But amazingly, after 25 years, what's being done with that software is just exactly the same as what it was before, which is very unlike other technologies like the telephone, where, yes, we all carry a telephone in our pocket now, but it does way more than the Bakelite telephone that your parents might have had on the countertop at home did, which was just for pure communications and nothing else.
Who truly understands how this data is implemented in a way to target ads? I always use the analogy or compare it to something like Google AdWords or Facebook targeting or Twitter, where I have experience buying ads, where it's okay, I understand that I buy this keyword and people are searching for that keyword. They're searching for that thing. They have intent. And so then I
Yeah.
have my ad that's appearing right there, and that's aligning a sentence really well. Same thing with Facebook. I know that I want a certain kind of audience, or LinkedIn, where I want a certain job title or something like that I want to target against. And so I can fundamentally mostly understand how that targeting works. Whereas if you asked me to make a programmatic ad buy, like at least an effective one, like I wouldn't even know where to begin. And like as someone who covers the media industry, I'm always just wondering like who truly understands, other than like people like you, like who like how to target. Is it are there people in all the different ad agencies that this is what they do all day? They're just in these data, platforms, and they really kind of understand how the nuts and bolts are happening, or are they just putting targeting parameters in there and just trusting that the system is going to figure it out?
Excellent question, because first of all, it is very, very technically complex and technically diverse in how many different things must occur in a tiny, in a millisecond, to effectuate all of this. But in an odd way, if you can just abstract a layer or two, it's really not that hard to understand the concept. And what I like to try to explain to folks who maybe aren't as deeply involved in it as someone like I am is there's somebody on the other end of every advertising impression that's out there. Now, sometimes it could be a bot, but when it's done properly, there is someone or some people on the other end, on the other side, seeing that, absorbing that, hearing that ad. Well, those people are represented to the ad tech industry by the device that is showing the ad. And for every one of those device types, whether it's a smart TV that you might have on the wall at home, or your mobile phone, or a laptop, or whatever, each of those has a different form of identity associated with you. And to the extent that the marketer, the advertiser, or their agency wants to and needs to understand the detail of the target really, really well, and we'll come back around to why that's not just automatically the case. To the extent that they have to understand the target really, really well, you want to identify the audience that will see the ad, if all goes well, by its characteristics, starting with the identifier that will represent that consumer when they're shown the ad. So if it's meant to be a connected television ad that's going to be shown on a smart TV, that identifier is an IP address. And it's the job of identity companies like Adstra to have a system that, in a privacy-safe way, accurately associates those device identifiers with real people, and then can provide descriptive data about those consumers that can be used to build an audience. And that's really what's going on from a consumer data standpoint. There's a lot more technology complexity that makes the actual ad run in front of the consumer than what I just described. But that's the easiest way I can describe to you why this part of the world that I'm in needs to exist, and why why our clients use us.
So because I'm logged in with, or I have my phone on the same Wi-Fi as my connected TV, like it's kind of parsing that data of like I surfed for some kind of content on my phone, and it tied it to that router, and basically through that router it's able to kind of determine that the person with this phone and the person watching this TV are kind of interested in the same things, or the
Yeah,
same
those
person.
are always those types of scenarios are always interesting, because I know, Adstra does not enable that for anybody. I would imagine my smart TV here in my den and office is a Google TV, and I could imagine Google being able to do that, but I would have had to have given Google permission to do that. I was really referring much more straightforwardly to how does an audience get attached to a bunch of ad impressions, and the link between the two, at least the most accurate link, is identity resolution of the type that we're able to do for advertisers. And to be clear, when we do that, everything is just expressed like a person is expressed as an alphanumeric persistent ID. It doesn't actually reveal any of the information about me or you or anybody, but it is all publicly available or permissioned descriptive information, and that's what good data-driven marketers who are targeting on an individual level need that. Now, I mentioned something earlier, which I think is important to bring in because this is changing rapidly in front of our eyes. But increasingly, there is a sort of a class of marketers, and I would say they're the more, let's say, less tenured marketers who are choosing to rely on just a black box. They just, Meta has Google has a product called Performance Max. Some people call it PMax, where it really is as simple as Google will say, how many SKUs do you want to advertise? What's your budget? Do you have creative? If not, we'll help you make it, and we'll deploy the campaign and tell you how many customers you've acquired as a result. And that's the allure of that sort of push button. Just give it over to somebody and they'll do it all for you. That doesn't require any of what I described a minute ago, because then it's all happening in the black box of Google or in the black box of Meta. What we find is increasingly, particularly CMOs, become very uncomfortable with that when something doesn't work right. And their boss says, well, why did that massive campaign not deliver what you thought? And you don't get a detailed answer from a black box, right? The black box just did what the black box does, and it's fairly inscrutable. So I was referring to really the kind of clients we work with where they really do want to know, this is, we're trying to reach single urban dwellers who've never owned a car, who are between the ages of X and Y. And that's the audience. Now we're going to take that audience to the trade desk, and the trade desk, a demand-side platform, already has an integration with us, so we can push that audience that's been made over to the trade desk, and the trade desk can show you that that exact audience was exposed to the ad that you wanted. That's data-driven advertising, and again, in the early aughts, that was really only direct mail. Was really the only way that that's done. And of course, now that's done across just about every form of media that there is.
You still kind of have to just trust. I mean, you could obviously always like measure the outcome, like brand lift, sales, and stuff like that. But you sort of have to trust that it is actually delivering the urban, whatever those demographics you just listed, like the single urban dweller who has never owned a car before.
Yes. You have to trust. You have to really pick your providers carefully, in my opinion. You have to know those companies put trustworthiness at the very center of what they do for many reasons. One of them is for privacy management. It's an enormously important part of our company to make sure everything we do is done in a privacy first and privacy safe manner. Anybody can just say that and hope that they're trusted, but you really want to pick providers that what they say that they're doing is what they're doing, and that they're willing to be scrutinized if need be, to show that they are worthy of the trust that the client is handing them. That's really the only way. There are some ways that you can try to benchmark and read results, and some ways that are important, but it all really comes down to making sure that you're working with the best companies in the industry, and that's people. At least for the time being, that's people.
Your customers are on the brand side, right? Mainly
brands, but also partners who serve brands. So we make our identity platform available inside of whatever technology environment our client wants. So when our client says, hey, we've decided, whether it's a brand or an agency, if they say we've decided to do all of our data collaboration in the Snowflake platform or in the Databricks platform, well, when the customer shows up and logs into their Snowflake platform, they need to be able to see that our tech works inside of those platforms. And so that's very common that we serve a lot of agencies. We serve the most all of the major agency holding companies, for them to be able to offer those capabilities to their clients. They don't all own the exact same capabilities that we have, but they still might need to be bringing those to their brand clients, to their agency of record clients.
So obviously, anytime I visit a website with programmatic advertising, there's all sorts of handshakes that are happening between these platforms on the
Yes.
supply side,
Yes.
the demand side. I believe
Yes.
Adstra is on the demand side. So walk me through me landing on an article on Fast Company, like how in as much layman terms as you can.
Yeah.
From me landing on it, like what's happening through all those different handshakes where does Adstra come in?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's happening, it's a really fun, I love the example. So let's walk through it, and I'm gonna do it from a couple of different angles to answer right away the question you're asking about. How does this physically happen? So typically in that situation, that publisher has an arrangement with the supply side. Either they could have done some of that themselves, but they probably are working with some sort of a supply side platform. That supply side platform is actually along with the demand side version of it, is helping make a match between a bid for a consumer's eyeballs and that particular ad. And that there's a whole pre-bid and bid technology that is very, very complex, that makes the market for that consumer to see that ad. Before those couple of milliseconds, that space is a black box on that page, because it hasn't yet learned what the market making combination of supply and demand delivered, in terms of that it's now you fell into an audience that someone was bidding for, your type of characteristics, your viewership behavior, whatever the descriptors were, and the ad impression that was available to run there. Adstra's role is just helping, and you're right, we're primarily on the demand side. We think actually in the coming year we'll be more formally moving to the supplies to also help make the supply side more intelligent with consumer data. But we're mostly on the demand side, and where we've already done our work when you land on that page is the publisher probably uses us to help understand who that was that landed on the page. Let's just assume for a moment you aren't a logged in subscriber to Fast Company in that example. Let's just assume that, but they still want to know, who is this visitor to our property, and how do we speak to them and make both our article content and our ads more relevant. And as you know from all the time you spent with publishers, publishers are typically not only selling ads, they're also trying to get people to subscribe and become regular identified users. And for many publishers, the fastest growing part of their business is commerce. So this will bring home to you, I think, in a different sort of way, where Adstra often can come in. If a publisher has commerce relationships, they usually have a lot of them. And when you land on that page, they don't just want to show you an ad for something that they can make money from. They also want to present you with relevant product offers that belong to their commerce partners. But if they have 500 commerce partners, how do they pick which, again, in milliseconds, how do they pick which commerce offers to put in front of you? Well, one way is contextually. So if you land on a article about travel to Ireland, well, it makes it a lot easier to use to show you a commerce offer from their partner Aer Lingus or something. That's contextual. They don't need to know anything about you. But increasingly, publishers are realizing they can vastly improve the yield from their commerce activities if, when that visitor lands and is not a logged in identified user, if they can still say, oh, this is a person under the age of 30, this is a single person, not a married person, this is a man, not a woman, this is a car owner or a non-car owner. Those types of things then trigger. Those are things that Adstra can provide them with in very near real time, and then that can trigger which combination of commerce offers has historically proven most relevant to people like that. And that's very much why a publisher would use our identity platform to try to know who a visitor is, to just be more relevant to them.
So I land on this publisher website, the supply side platform supplies Adstra with some information about me, and then you kind of look through your client
Or
base.
sometimes on the supply side, they've aligned with a data company that is working strictly with the supply side to make that inventory more intelligent. In that case, that's a play to make the yield to make the yield of those impressions more valuable even before they've been bid on in the marketplace. And on the demand side, it's trying to help the publisher to do better with that consumer than they would have done in the absence of that information. And I have to tell you, I am not the expert to tell you how all that machinery in the bid process works. It's enormously complicated. But typically we're engaged in the conversation with the person who's buying the advertising, who wants to buying the advertising, and who wants to reach and treat visitors and customers most relevantly, because they want that relationship to be worth as much as it can be.
How much does the publisher understand all this versus they're just optimizing for who's paying me the highest CPMs and with ad loads that aren't going to break my website kind of thing?
It's very dependent on the publisher. And because of how complex and how fast changing the industry is, it's very difficult for humans to stay on top of it all, which is one reason why some segment of, whether it's publishers or marketers or agencies, there is a certain kind of person who says, look, we cannot be experts in every single aspect of this, so let us hit the easy button over here. But what we exist to do is to give visibility into that black box. And so, we talk a lot about how once the brand is speaking to is advertising to individuals, they need to own and control their definition of the consumer, not rely on what a black box tells them the definition of the consumer is. So we put that transparency and control in the brand's hands that allows them to take that with them to the black box, and immediately they're more intelligent about what the black box is doing, because now they know they didn't just say to the black box, you pick the audience. They can hand the audience to the black box, and then the black box can tell them what percentage of that audience was actually matched and reached. And by the way, the black box, when there's a lot of incredibly powerful data, as you know, in the black box that we might call meta, and it's all of that behavior, all of that viewing behavior and posting behavior that they have that allows them to pick an audience well. The problem is they don't share with the brand how that works. That's sort of their secret sauce. And so when a brand feels like they don't understand why something is or isn't working, that's one of the reasons that they come to Adstra.
So are the brands or the ad agencies, are you working with them directly, or are you just plugging into some piece of technology that they're using for their ad buying?
Both, because sometimes a very small brand or a challenger brand, they just won't have the resources to have a department of people focused on identity, first-party identity resolution and management. It requires an investment, and that exceeds the ability of some smaller companies. And in that case, they're going to go to an agency or another platform, and we want our tech and our data to already be there and be available so that we can help them in that way. So for example, media buyers at an agency trading desk who are literally responsible for, they've just received the insertion order briefing from their group supervisor in the agency, and it says, you should be reaching 1 million people over this frequency of of ads and we want the audience to look like this. If that agency trading desk media buyer then goes, activates the seat that they have on the trade desk, the demand side platform, the trade desk, they will find in the trade desk a bunch of Adstra syndicated audiences that are pre-built, and they can say, oh, well, we did want first-time auto buyers, we did want people, over this age or whatever, and they can, using an off-the-shelf audience, that's manufactured by Adstra, they can actually select that, press a button, deploy it for that campaign. That's very often what happens, but more sophisticated brands are doing much of that themselves and not using an agency, and so they're versed and they're talking directly to us on their version of that. It might be, please build us a custom audience that looks like this. We plan to use it in these various forms of media, and then we do that for them. They pull it down off of into their technology environment, and then they take that portably to whatever activation platform they use to perform their advertising. It really just comes down to level of sophistication of the user and how involved they want to be in hands-on keyboards, if you will, and it just varies. It's kind of all over the map. Different companies have different cultures and levels of sophistication around that.
How do you become a sophisticated buyer? Because I'm very skeptical that marketing majors in college are like logging into ad tech, marketing tech platforms and being taught how to use these in a hands-on manner, especially since these things, like you said, are changing all the time. Like, is it just like you just get an entry job? Is it just a matter of just getting an entry level job at an ad buying agency, and then you just kind of, through having like people above you're just like slowly kind of learning through osmosis or something like that? Because like, I just have a hard. It's not like going to be a computer software engineer where you're learning this like coding, language and stuff like that, or some other kind of like skilled trades and stuff like that. Like, what's the learning curve, or how do you become a sophisticated ad buyer?
The most sophisticated data-driven advertisers I know are that way because they had an insatiable appetite for learning what they didn't know. It would be amiss not to mention that very, very important threshold thing. You have to, it's so complicated. You have to really want to learn it. Not everyone does, not everyone has the time, but it's also changing just since the pandemic. I just went to teach a class at Kellogg at Northwestern on identity resolution in customer experience. That wasn't being taught at Kellogg or really any business school I know of, very long ago. I mean, that's a relatively new thing. And then these students, I was just so impressed. They were almost like a different species. They were so smart about this stuff compared to what I knew about anything when I was sitting in their seats in 1992. So there is, I think, there are people coming out of school now understanding this in a way that they just did not understand it before. But that still doesn't make them an expert on day one. You have to be in the trenches, skinning your knees and learning, and the technology is constantly changing underneath you. And the most successful people are the ones who are just cannot go to bed at night not understanding something that they saw that day that they didn't already know. And that is a characteristic that is typical of the best people in our industry. That I've been in a few other industries. It wasn't evident in the other industries that I was in.
So in the early 2010s, when a lot of this like kind of modern day programmatic advertising was coming online, I remember having coffee with someone, a friend or a colleague who worked at like one of these ad buying agencies. And she was like making this argument that you heard a lot at the time, is like that now like targeting was good, like scale, like, media companies can now have the same level of ad targeting scale as like the big tech platforms like Google, and this will level the playing field, and that, you know, the CPMs are going to only, for premium publishers, are only going to keep on going back up, and we're going to be able to like put all this toothpaste back in the tube, and we're no longer trading digital pennies for print dollars type of thing. Like there was like all this optimism. Flash
Yes.
forward 15 year or 12 years later, the tech platforms are still getting more and more marketing share every year, and that's all coming from the publisher side. Now Amazon's taking that marketing share. It seems like programmatic never really like is no longer living up to that promise, or never did. Why do you like why can now that theoretically programmatic allows publishers to have the same level of scale of inventory collectively to the tech platforms, why are the tech platforms still outperforming the the media companies and stealing more and more share? I have my theories, but I'd love to hear what you have to say about it.
Setting aside hegemony for a moment and a drive to what is the old Peter Thielism, winner take most, which is one of those Silicon Valley euphemisms for monopoly. Setting that aside, that's one reason. But performance-wise, they work better because when they work better because the data is better. I mean, we could dig for more nuanced versions of that answer, but that's to me, that's the biggest single answer. The level of information. Pick whatever your favorite social platform is. I'm largely off social other than LinkedIn, but it's even true for LinkedIn. The amount of data that they have about me, just based on who I know, who I'm interacting with, how frequently I'm doing it, it's extraordinary. I remember in maybe 2013 or so, when I was just starting to work with Facebook back then, and a Facebook engineer described to me that, I'll just paraphrase because it's been a long time, but trying to explain to me the size of their database. And I said, well, sure, it's got to be huge just for the number of users. No. I mean, how many things we know. And I said, well, give me an example. 4-finger scrolling speed. And then there are like hundreds of variables like that are just about how the person is physically interacting with their device, their mobile device. That there is just an enormous amount of data that they can use to predict. That to me is the reason. Now but maybe I should adopt your viewpoint that somehow programmatic has failed because of that, but I don't really see it that way, because programmatic was partly about, as you said, democratizing advertising in a way that didn't make just the massive agency the gatekeeper for everything. And I think it has succeeded fabulously on that dimension. We know many brands that would have felt the need to go through an agency like the one you were talking to at the time, who was promising the ease of you, but don't even need an agency anymore, because the tools, and it's not just when we say the programmatic industry, there's a lot of players in there, like good demand side platforms like the Trade Desk and Google V360 and Viant and Basis and companies like that. There are even some that are not very large, but they are all participants in making data-driven advertising accessible to brands that 15 years ago would not have been able to do that on their own. So I don't see it as a total failure, other than taking your point about just adding up the share that now accrues to the walled gardens. That's enormous and growing, but it's not the only option for an advertiser. And many advertisers we know don't use those platforms. By the way, there's another problem that accrues. We're all aware of the phenomenon of the digitally native vertical brand. So the companies that only grew and only put themselves on the map by using paid search and paid social to drive revenue. Well, an interesting thing happens. We have a lot of those clients in our company. And an interesting thing happens to those companies where if they've been reliant purely on paid search and paid social, there almost always comes a point where the lifetime value of the next customer is less than the cost to acquire them. And that's a holy crap moment, if we might
Because it's performance
say it that.
marketing versus brand marketing.
Well, and there's only going to be so many in Meta. There is not an infinite supply of Warby Parker customers in using Meta. There isn't an infinite supply of those who will convert. So as you reach that asymptote, the impressions Meta charges more, right? Because you're having to go further afield to find the same person. And so that's a moment where many of our brands realize exactly how diverse their media plan should be, and many of them often double down on programmatic at that point.
So I have a theory for why.
I'd love to hear it.
So it's based on three pillars. One is the pillar that you mentioned, is they have a unified platform where they can collect just better and more data because it's not fragmented across millions of different websites. Like, Google only has a handful of platforms. Meta only has a handful of platforms. And a lot of these people are voluntarily giving them information that they can use, like filling out their profiles and stuff like that. So I agree with you on that. I think another pillar is they have native advertising at scale. Yes. I think no matter how good your targeting is, I think a display ad is just not a great form of marketing, especially not a great form of performance marketing. Like, people just don't look at display ads. There's ad blindness and stuff like that, versus a native ad looks like the other content in the feed. Your eyes are going to at least gloss over it for a few seconds simply because it looks like every other post in the feed. So whether it's the AdWords sitting at the top or a promoted Facebook post, it looks like every other kind of Facebook post. And for some reason, other than Taboola and Outbrain and stuff like that, publishers have never really tried to develop their own native advertising tech that can be bought at scale. And whatever native advertising you can buy with publishers, it's super expensive because they have to they're creating it themselves. They have a content, creativity team, which I've worked, I did that for Politico. I was writing their native advertising articles for their, for their branded content. And it's just it would take several months just to, in terms of the entire approval process for the article. So that didn't scale. And then the third pillar is easy self-service advertising. So if you're a plumber in Washington, D.C., where I live, you can sign up for an advertising account on AdWords and start spending $10 a month. And you could see that ROI. And then as your business grows, you can start putting more and more money in it. And then suddenly, you're spending $5,000 a month or something like that. So there's this natural entry point for hundreds of millions of small businesses to where they can start small and gradually grow. You don't need to go through, a major ad agency to do it. And whereas, as you say, it might be getting a little bit easier to buy programmatic ads, you really still need to have a certain level brand size and ad budget before you can even get into it. So there's not there's tens of millions of businesses that will never do display programmatic advertising because of that kind of high barrier to entry. So I think it's those three pillars that have made for instance, I know self-published authors who are buying ads on Amazon's platform because it's so simple and you understand where your ad's appearing. When someone's searching for romance werewolves, that you wrote a romance werewolf novel and that's exactly where you want your book to show up in the search results. It's very simple, and I just don't think that simplicity happens on the programmatic ad side.
I say, so well articulated on your three pillars, and you can see how I'm a data guy, so my bias is for the data piece. But I agree 100% with your much more thorough analysis than mine. One of the things though, bringing it back to identity, is you're still at the mercy of each different stack you're using. That's not a problem for the plumber in Washington because they're not a sophisticated, they're very small probably, they're not sophisticated. But for the mainstream of people who use some combination of media, including social media, including search, there's a serious limitation to not being able to use the same customer definition in each of those platforms that needs to be solved for regardless of how much you like any one medium, whether programmatic or any other. And that's really that's the role we play.
Yeah. So when you look ahead like 2 to 3 years from now, what do you want to be doing then that you're not doing now? What would you like Adstra's capabilities? How would you like to see this market evolve to, have, better use of data, better targeting for brand side, better CPMs and outcomes for publisher side? What do you think needs to improve? Especially as someone who worked at IAB or was it a director at IAB? What was or board member?
Yeah, I was on the board.
Yeah. Like,
Yeah.
What would you like to see happen in the industry?
Well, I think one of the most exciting things, and this is where I believe Adstra will go, is in our company and this is typically true for well-run data companies. The financial model of companies like ours is very high operating leverage. So it costs us a great deal to have the platform and the product we have, but then, like software, every new additional copy of it is essentially, very low variable cost. So that gives us a great deal of operating leverage. Our stuff lends itself to helping customers with a service layer because, like we talked about earlier, the less sophisticated clients want access to the power of identity and data-driven advertising, but they might still need help. How do I do this? How do I connect this and this? I have a partnership. I want to do a co-marketing between Ford Motor Company and Hilton Hotels. How do I make the two first-party data sets match? And that's all sort of lends itself towards some services layer, but the business model of a data company is diluted substantially by a heavy people-based services cost layer. I think that's rapidly changing now because of AI. And I think one of the most exciting things that it will mean for Adstra is we will deliver services towards digesting identity and making better campaign decisions. We will deliver those at the same margin levels as our data business, which never would have been possible before we could use AI in addition to people. When it was just people, that was the world of agencies, and that's not the model that we wanted. Now we can actually begin to bring those services cost effectively to our customers.
We just head towards a future where we're just trusting the AI to figure this out. Because like everything I read about it is like even the people who create these large language models, they have a high-end understanding of or high-level understanding of what's happening inside that, but it's really just a black box, and they really they couldn't like deconstruct what it's learning. Like, is there just going to be all this data going into this black box, and there's this AI figuring out, this brand and this customer are somehow matched together, and you, even as the ad tech executive, can't even explain how the AI determined that?
Well, now we're getting into a little bit of AI philosophy. I love that. I would argue it's already happening today for the reasons I mentioned before. In many cases, I would argue Meta cannot tell you why.
Yeah, I've heard this too from people doing ad buys on Meta. Is like it used to be that you had to put in all these targeting parameters, and now you just kind of give it some vague information about your customer and what your outcomes are, and it just figures it out on its own.
And the reason I think this gets you into another conversation about AI philosophy is it's already happening now. It will therefore happen more. How far will that go? Well, I don't know exactly, but I know that if you take it to its ultimate extreme, then you're talking about UBI and things like that, because what are human beings even doing at that point? And you'd say, oh, they're spending money that they make where? At the company that they no longer have a job at. And so you really do get into it. You have to start thinking about what kind of a society do we want to live in when machines of various forms can essentially do every form of work that there is. And I happen to be a believer. I can't pinpoint a time frame, but I'm a believer that that's the very logical conclusion of where we're headed. But was having breakfast yesterday morning with an old friend and industry colleague who's a CEO, and he just adamantly disagrees with that. He thinks that
Everybody
humans will
always find 40 hours of work to week into
That's
perpetuity.
right. That's right. I think we're in a different. I mean, this is clearly the most exciting, impactful, horizontal technology in my lifetime since the web. But it's way, as you would, I'm sure, agree, it's way more impactful and way further ranging than the web was in its day. And so I think we are headed for a very, very different economy in the future. And I always encourage people to follow Tristan Harris. He'd be a great person to have on your podcast. If you don't know who he is, he was a Google designer who then has dedicated his post-Google years to trying to make everyone realize where all this is headed. And he's just written a book about AI, where he's very much concerned that we're headed towards a world, and people don't realize that we're headed towards a world where there won't be a lot for humans to do. I can look at that optimistically as well, but we have to wrestle with the challenging parts of it, like the question you asked: are we just headed for a world where bots are talking to other bots and humans are just off fishing somewhere? I think it's a perfectly good question that nobody really has the answer to.
Hey, Rick, those were all the questions I have for you. Where can people find you online?
Oh, you can find me on LinkedIn and under Rick Erwin, and you can find me at rick.erwin@adstradata.com. And I'm always interested in engaging with people from all walks of life, touching our industry directly or indirectly. And so I'd love to hear from anybody who wants to reach out.
Well, this is a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much.